I want to welcome John Nichols, who's the national affairs correspondent of the magazine The Nation. He's a pioneering political blogger. His pieces have been circulated internationally, quoted in numerous books, mentioned in debates on the floor of Congress. He has a good hand for very good book titles, and you can find some of his books on the book table. I'm just going to mention Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, that's pretty good, and The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, published. That was a big hit just recently, and he's also the author of Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. So bring those alliterations on. He's a wonderful orator. He's been here before. He's from our sister city of Madison. He's brought his wife, Mary Boutari, with him, who's the chief of staff of the city of Madison. And she's a wonderful person to talk to. So I recommend that. It's wonderful to have you here again. I trust you to talk about almost anything, really. We'll talk about Whitman and Schurz, what Carl-Schurz and Walt Whitman teach us about today's struggle for democracy. And the little fun fact, I know you have your own good jokes, so I can already tell everyone, Mary Boutari and John Nichols have a daughter, and she's called Whitman. So welcome, John Nichols.
Bye. Thank you very much. Yes, our daughter is called Whitman, named Whitman, and so as a result, I had no choice when you issued the invitation. The only great tragedy is that she is in university now and couldn't come with us, because if you know my daughter, she is the ultimate Walt Whitman character. She does believe she contains multitudes, and that everything feeds into her. And so if she was here, she would certainly believe that this entire conference, this entire festival was done in her honor. And we will tell her as much when we get home. So I want to first off thank Kai, fabulous remarks. Thank you so much. I cherish that final quote from Goethe, because that to me sums everything up. This question of we have so many iconic figures, and we'll talk about two of them in just a moment, and yet neither of them gave us everything that we needed. And so as a result, we look always at our great intellectual, our great poetic leaders, and understand that we need something more. And that something more is us. That something more is what we add to the equation. Because what is the point of reading literature? What is the point of reading political theory if we don't ultimately take from it and build something better, something stronger, something bigger? And of course, the great challenge is, in America, my country today, we're doing the opposite. Too frequently, we read political literature, we read the great ideas of the country, and we pluck one tiny part from it, one narrow, small bit from it, and we say, well, this proves my point. And so we must do exactly what I say. And we don't read or understand the whole of it. And we don't know that throughout our history, people have disagreed. And throughout our history, we have made horrible errors, which at our best we have tried to correct. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to ask you to do the hard work of my speech. And that is, I would like everyone, if they could, to stand up. All right, that's kind of good. I actually prefer that there's not a coffee break between speeches, because then when I let people stand up, they love it, right? They feel freed from their chairs and ready to stretch and enjoy. But I'm not going to let everyone stand up for very long. Would all the women please sit down? It's good. We have a large contingent of women with us today. Would all people of color, someone who is not, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, please sit down? Okay. Would everyone who is a religious dissenter, someone who maybe doesn't practice mainstream Protestantism, please sit down? I'm always struck how many we lose on that question. Now, would everyone who is not a wealthy property owner substantial property owner, please sit down. Is anyone standing at this point? The photographer, but I think he is an indentured servant by any measure. And so I want you to look at everyone who is standing, and I would myself have to be sitting if I wasn't at this podium. Everyone who is standing, that's who could have voted at the founding of the American experiment. Everyone who is sitting in 1787, 1789, 1791, everyone who is sitting could not have voted. You were excluded from participating in the process. And so when the United States was founded, we were not founded as a democracy. And then imagine that. We've come out on this Saturday morning for this great event, and none of us could participate. All of us would have to stand on we'd do what they did, and this is actually what happened in the 1780s, 1790s in the United States. When they had elections, they would gather all the wealthy property owners in a small room, much smaller than this, and the candidates would speak. James Madison, a future president, he would speak. One year he ran against James Monroe, a future president. They were both running for Congress. They were debating whether to have a Bill of Rights in our Constitution, and they had great debates. And all of the voters who could vote on their campaign were in the room, all 200 or 300 of them. And outside the windows, because we didn't vote in November then, we voted in September. Outside the windows, they would open them, and thousands of people would be looking in. The enslaved people, the indentured servants, the women, the religious dissenters, the great mass of people looking in. They knew what was happening. They knew that decisions were being made, but they had no voice whatsoever, no democratic voice whatsoever in making those decisions. Because America was not founded by small d Democrats. America was founded by revolutionaries, by people who were anti-monarchist, anti-colonialist, some of them quite radical for their times, many of them Enlightenment thinkers. But by and large, with the exception of Thomas Paine, who is, of our founders, the most radical and the most enlightened, aside from Thomas Paine and a handful of others, they didn't even imagine democracy. It's not that they opposed it. They simply didn't imagine it. And to the extent that they did imagine it, in the case of James Madison, our fourth president, they feared it. And their great fear of democracy led them to create a system that was filled with what we call checks and balances, but were really often guardrails against popular democracy. And so in the United States today, we have an electoral college. And every time I speak in Germany, I apologize for not explaining the electoral college because it would take the whole day. Our electoral college is a separate entity created so that after an election, if a small group of people don't like the results of an election, they could potentially change it. And if they don't sort things out the way that they like, then it ends up in Congress in this long and complicated process. But the thing to understand is this. In the last 25 years, less than 25 years, we have had 2 presidents of the United States lose the popular vote, lose the democracy, and yet become president of the United States. One of them was George W. Bush, and that certainly ended well. We had a war in Iraq that lasted and lasted and lasted, undeclared wars, a diminution of any sort of popular will as regards our foreign policy. And then he and his vice president, Dick Cheney, gave tax cuts to the rich, helped to change our banking laws with a little help from a Democrat, Bill Clinton, before, and ended up crashing the global economy. So there you go, very successful unelected president. And then 16 years after Bush became president of the United States, another candidate lost. In this case, this candidate lost by 3 million votes in our popular vote for president of the United States and still became president. His name was Donald Trump. And again, some people have some sense that maybe that didn't turn out as well as had been hoped. And Donald Trump's presidency ended in a coup attempt in which thousands of his supporters stormed the Capitol of the United States, injured more than 140 police officers, left as many as 5 people dead, and ended up creating a circumstance where the resolution of the 2020 presidential election was actually delayed. Our basic democratic processes were delayed by an insurrection. Now, later that night, the police finally cleared the Capitol, and this president, Donald Trump, grudgingly said, "Go home," to the insurrectionists, before adding, "We love you." And they did finally complete the election process, but today we have a committee researching our insurrection and coming to the conclusion that in many cases we were sometimes seconds, moments away from a circumstance where that process might well have collapsed. Even talk of executing the Vice President of the United States if he didn't go along with this coup attempt. So, that's the Electoral College and how it works. And then we have, it's important to understand, when the founders created our experiment, they created an unelected United States Senate. It wasn't elected by the people, very powerful, upper chamber of our Congress, but not elected by the people. It was appointed by state legislators. And I don't have enough money in my pocket to illustrate the bribes that were used by people to get into the United States Senate. You didn't get into the United States Senate because you were the smartest or the best or the wisest. You often got into the United States Senate because you were the most connected, the most politically tied, the wealthiest, the whitest, the most male, the most, you run down it. Our United States Senate was not a representative body in any sense. In fact, it wasn't even democratically chosen. It wasn't until 1913, more than 100 and some years after the founding of the country, that we finally decided to have an elected Senate, right? But even that, we still kept a set of rules that said small states would have the same votes in the Senate, equal power to big states. Now, what did that mean? We have a state called Wyoming where you can get elected to the United States Senate with about 150,000 votes. We have another state called California where to get elected to the U.S. Senate, you need about 5, 6, 7 million votes. When they get to the Senate, the senator from Wyoming can cancel out the senator from California. And so at our founding, we created a situation where small, more rural, and more conservative states literally have the power to veto the large states and effectively to veto democracy. And if that is not enough, again, as I illustrated to some extent with your standing and sitting, we didn't have universal voting rights. We didn't even begin to explore that concept. But over the first 75 years of the American experiment, we did begin to explore the concept. And by the 1850s, many of the religious barriers had fallen. If you were Catholic or Mennonite or Jewish, you could vote. In most states in America, they even had barriers still to some extent, but many of the religious barriers had fallen. Many of the barriers to indentured servants had fallen. Those who did not have a lot of property, in many cases, you could vote. So there was a beginning, sort of a bit of movement toward democracy. And yet, we maintained no votes for women and no votes for the people who did immense amounts of the work of building the country. And that included, yes, some immigrants, but also people who were forced to come to the country through the process of human bondage, people who were enslaved. Millions of Americans who were living in this country, predominantly black people, not allowed to vote. This brutal reality that was accepted by our founders, this brutal reality underpinned our Civil War. And our Civil War was a war about many things, including voting rights. It's interesting that in his last days, Abraham Lincoln devoted almost all of his time to amendments to the United States Constitution that extended the right to vote. And after Lincoln's death, that ultimately were enacted, and these extended the right to vote to black men. And that's an incredible thing. Imagine this. People who had been enslaved at one point, in short order, were given the right to vote. And in relatively short order, were sitting in that United States Senate, were sitting in the Congress of the United States, were serving in legislatures. This was a remarkable progression, an amazing step forward. And in this period, two men rose as prominent figures in our politics and as prominent figures in our culture. One was Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, born in the United States, of Quaker background, a religious dissenter, a remarkable young figure who did not get a lot of formal education, but learned his craft on the streets. He literally, people don't remember or understand, Walt Whitman didn't just write poetry. He didn't just write Leaves of Grass. He didn't just write Song of Myself or Democratic Vistas. He was a printer. He literally set the type for his books. He produced his own books because he was a craftsman of the streets. He came from a culture of taverns and, places of ill repute. And he rose from this background and wrote a poetry that was so infused with a concept, a romantic notion of democracy, that he said in one of his first pieces of writing. And I have a few things here I will read not so well or not so much as my friend, but I speak the password primeval. I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Simply, he said, his view of democracy was equality. Equal power, equal participation, equal engagement. This was a radical view. This was why many people saw Whitman as a socialist. Why Edward Carpenter, the great British writer, wrote of him as such. And when Whitman was confronted with Carpenter's writing, said, well, I guess I am something of a socialist. The fact of the matter is Whitman had a very radical view, not just of democracy, but of a fullness of democracy. We were just discussing that a moment ago. And he brought this to the table, and it was a living, vibrant part of the discourse in his time. But there were others who came in his time who were a little bit more concerned about whether you could just have this romantic view, and thought maybe you had to do a little more structural work. And the key among these was Carl-Schurz. Carl-Schurz, born in Germany, born in Prussia, came to America not by choice, but as an outlaw, as a refugee from war. Carl-Schurz was a 48er. In 1848, he had joined in the German Revolution and in the revolutions that swept across Europe. He was a radical dissenter. He was not a perfect man. He had his flaws. Even his views of democracy and many of his actions later in life can be questioned and challenged. But in that 1848 revolutionary moment, he was a believer that you could overturn structures of power and replace them with more small d democratic structures. He failed, and like many of the 48ers, he got the hell out of Germany, and he looked, where can I go? Because remember, there had been revolutions across Europe, in Hungary, efforts in France, efforts in other places. And so the 48ers didn't have anywhere to go. They were not welcomed except in the United States. They came to the United States. And those German 48ers and some of their allies from Hungary and other places, when they arrived in the United States, they immediately, being the good Prussians, in this case with Schurz, being the good Prussians, they decided that they would show people how to do things. And so they immediately got involved in politics, and Schurz became, literally within years, a couple of years of his arrival, he was helping to form a new political party, a radical political party that was truly deeply influenced by many socialists, by many radicals from different traditions, by anti-slavery activists and abolitionists, the Republican Party. Carl-Schurz, whose name we honor, was a key figure in founding the Republican Party. And he brought the German immigrants, who were a massive immigration community, into the Republican Party and agitated for it to be a radical party, to be a party that would seek fundamental change. But his radicalism was not anarchical. He wasn't seeking change for the sake of change. What Schurz was talking about was to make changes that would actually democratize the United States, that would open up the process and have structures that were better, frankly, than those that the founders had. Schurz chose, in his lifetime, as an immigrant, to be a founder. He wanted to found a different and better America. And he was very specific about this, very agile in his language, very active in his movement joining. And as a result, he was quickly raised to a high position of prestige. Remember, this is a guy who immigrated to the United States after 1848. By the mid-1850s, he was a candidate for statewide office in my state of Wisconsin, another reason why I had to come today. And he was a close ally of Abraham Lincoln and the other leaders of the Republican Party. By the time Lincoln became president, Schurz was such an intimate of Lincoln that he served as an ambassador to Spain and as a key advisor during the Civil War. Now, interestingly, he was not the only 48er who was a key advisor during the Civil War. As many as 32 of the generals, colonels, lieutenants, key figures in the Northern American military, the Union military during the Civil War, fighting against slavery, fighting against the South, were German 48ers. They had military experience. Most of our American generals, when the war started, they were Southerners. They went to side with the South in this rebellion against the United States. And so Lincoln and his allies needed people with military skills. They turned to these Germans. Schurz was absolutely critical in aligning these immigrants with Lincoln, the Republican Party, and ultimately the Union cause. So he played a critical role. You cannot underestimate the role that he played. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, for a moment, there was a sense of great celebration and possibility. Yes, we heard on Thursday night singing of "O Captain, My Captain," the wonderful Whitman poem in which he reflected on the death of Abraham Lincoln, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, this incredibly turbulent time, but still a time with some measure of hope. And they did pass amendments to extend the Constitution. They did pass amendments to extend democracy. But at the exact same time, we saw the rise of a militant anti-democratic movement that sought to reverse the immediate changes and, in fact, to take the United States back even further, in some cases, than it had been in its founding, to make it less democratic even than at its founding. This movement, rooted in the South, but certainly not limited to the South, was exemplified by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, a violent, radical grouping that sought to deny political power to the black men in the South who had just been empowered, to black people in general, but also notably to Catholics, to Jews, to others who might be, quote, in their view, different from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant vision that they advanced. Very important thing to understand about this. You know, when we talk about Germany and its horrible turns in the 1930s, there were Germans who came and studied the philosophies of southern states and the Ku Klux Klan. They were interested in what these people had done with their racial theories. So this was violent, awful stuff. And it was night riders coming through, attacking black people who participated in politics, attacking polling places, attacking democracy itself. And so it is no surprise that by 1871, both Walt Whitman and Carl-Schurz were worried about democracy. Now, that's why Democratic Vistas is such an interesting piece of work, why it is, in fact, the perfect touchstone for this discussion today. Because Democratic Vistas is not Song of Myself. It is not a piece of poetry where Walt Whitman said, I give the password primeval, I give the sign of democracy. No. This is where Walt Whitman said, I'm a little concerned that this thing might not work out well. Maybe we should be thinking about what we are up to here and how we might do this. And I give you just a short line from him. He talked about a raging battle, advancing, retreating. Let me pause there and say, advancing, retweeting. It is how much I have been infected by our modern era. Advancing, retreating between democracy's convictions, aspirations, and the people's crudeness, vice, caprices. I mainly write this essay, he said in this context, I shall use the words America and democracy as convertible terms, not an ordinary one in this issue. The United States are destined either to surmount the gorgeous history of feudalism or else prove the most tremendous failure of all time. This is Whitman, the poet of democracy, saying that we're in a place now where this American experiment might be the most tremendous failure of all time. Now, of course, Whitman being the romantic, which is why we named our daughter after him, Whitman being the romantic still held out great hope, as do I, for the small d democratic experiment. But Carl-Schurz, being the good Prussian, was a little bit more concerned even than Whitman. And Schurz, by now, had become a United States senator, appointed from the state of Missouri, very prominent, one of the most brilliant members of the Senate. And in his context in the Senate, he had that wonderful line which the ambassador quoted. In fact, the ambassador made really a central frame of her speech the other night, in which he was in a debate, and someone had attacked him for his views and had suggested that he was unpatriotic. And at that point, this is a fellow senator attacking him, and also attacking him as an immigrant, suggesting that as an immigrant he might not understand America quite so well. He said, the senator from Wisconsin, hold it, Wisconsin comes up again? The senator from Wisconsin cannot frighten me by exclaiming, my country right or wrong. In one sense, I say so too. My country is the great American Republic. My country right or wrong, if right to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right. Now, wonderful framing for this, but that debate continued, and it went deeper. And as the debate continued, that was where Schurz said, Sir, it is time that we should look at the dangers that threaten the Republic in their face. It is not likely that this Republic will succumb to the shock of force, but to the slower and no less fatal disease of corruption and demoralization, and the decay of constitutional principles. It is time for us to keep in mind that it requires more to make and preserve a republic than the mere absence of a king, and that when a republic decays, its soul is apt to die first, while its outward form may still be lasting. Its soul is apt to die first, the outward form to go on. Over the 100 years following Schurz's remarks, the exact 100 years following Schurz's remarks, the United States, in many senses, did exactly what we would have wanted it to do. And I speak as a small d Democrat, as a great respecter of this small d democratic experiment. The United States did what we would want it to do at the demand of women, not as a gift. The United States never gives gifts. At the demand of women, the franchise was expanded so that half of humanity could participate in elections. Women got the right to vote in 1920. And at that same time, a time of great ferment and great change, the first peoples of the United States, Native Americans, folks sometimes referred to as Indians, Native Americans demanded the right to vote. And only in the 1920s were Native Americans, in many cases, not all, given the right to vote. Latinx people, people from Central America, South America, and other parts of the world who had immigrated to the United States, living in the southwestern United States in particular, in the 1940s, demanded the right to vote and faced brutal barriers to it. Only in the 1960s, following again, the United States does not give the United States response to demands. Frederick Douglass always, that power concedes nothing without a demand. Because of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, we got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, incredible, radical steps toward democracy. And actually presidents, Eisenhower and then Johnson, who were willing to send U.S. troops, at least U.S. militarized forces, we should say, in to support democracy internally, right? This is an incredible concept. And so this fight for democracy was expanding, and then it wasn't the only thing. In the mid-1960s, we passed a constitutional amendment that did away with the poll tax. So finally, after almost 200 years, we said that poverty couldn't be a barrier to voting in the United States. So all these people, remember when we were all standing up and then sitting down? Suddenly everybody's starting to stand up, right? Everybody's starting to come into that room that was closed and participate. And then in the late 1960s, early 1970s, at the demand of young people who were being sent to fight in Vietnam in a war that was unpopular, we extended voting rights to 18 to 21-year-olds so that those who were sent to fight wars could actually decide whether they wanted that war. So suddenly, 100 years after Schurz said, and remember he said that we have to worry about the outward form, and that's the structures, that's the infrastructure of democracy, we'd actually done a lot. In a 100-year period, we had actually come to a point where this notion of democracy became very real. So real that it terrified power. Economic and political power as it existed was horrified. And it began to move in very structural and sophisticated ways to undermine that democracy. We don't have enough time today to go through all of the assaults on democracy that have occurred over the last 50 years. They come from many directions. Constitutional, judicial rulings that make it possible for one individual or one group of individuals to spend as much money as they want to influence the process, often secretly. Our campaign finance system, a disaster. Rulings that have allowed for the diminution of labor unions, of other groupings in our society, always a traditional way of assaulting democracy. Rulings and actions that have made it harder to vote, literally requiring that you have to show all kinds of identification just to cast your ballot, much more than just saying, oh, I'm this person, but actually, paperwork upon paperwork. Literally limiting the times at which people can vote. All sorts of structural assaults on democracy. We are now in a late stage of a 50-year assault on democracy. And how convenient it is if we understand, going back to what Schurz was saying 100 years earlier, saying, you've got to look at that outward form. You've got to do this structural stuff. We come in 100 years, we do a lot of it, not all of it, but we really move in some very good directions, and then suddenly we start deconstructing. We start attacking the soul of democracy. The soul itself is under assault. And then we come to the current moment. And in the current moment, it's probably best to understand that there's now in America an open question of whether democracy will survive. Now, I'm not someone who is a great conspiracy theorist. I'm also not someone who is I'm not a fretful person. I tend to be a very hopeful person. But the truth is that these discussions are very rich and very alive in America today. And they come from the events that we discussed at the beginning of this talk, right? An electoral college that produces unelected presidents. A coup where literally our capital is attacked. A former president who travels the United States now as the most prominent figure in America. I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, Joshua, but we will, the most prominent figure in America literally saying that he is the legitimate president of the United States, not the sitting president. Donald Trump going on rallies across the country saying he is actually the sitting president of the United States, not the person who sits in the Oval Office. And a movement that literally supports and sustains that view. Perhaps not a majority movement, but remember, in America, you don't have to have the majority to win. You can become president without getting the majority of votes. You can run the Senate, right, with small states and not with senators who represent the majority of voters. So a movement that is a minority in America can, in fact, prevail in our structurally unsound democracy. And so this is where we end up. And we end up, frankly, coming back to Walt Whitman. Because worst of all in America today, we have lost faith in democracy as a romantic and idealistic and hopeful and possible goal. In America today, when we talk about democracy, And you will have a great speech from Joshua Sellers. You'll have great speeches from other folks that'll dig deeper into this. When we talk about democracy in America, we talk about it in a way that is so ungrounded, that is so uprooted from an understanding of any of the history, an understanding of what, how we might operate in this, what values we might bring to it, that it is actually grabbed by both sides of the debate. And too often, it is not about democracy. It is about power. It's not about being right or wrong. It's not about getting the most votes, certainly. It is about how do I get power and how do I hold on to that power at any cost whatsoever. We have a tremendous number of Americans who do now accept a win at any stake, win at any cost, victory at any cost politics. And I have to tell you, these are on both sides of the political divide. But I don't think there's any question. And on the Republican side of the political divide, this is a much deeper and more intense view. It has taken great hold within one of our major political parties. And it leads us in this point where we have to question, what is democracy? I mean, how do we think about democracy, and how do we think about how it ought to operate? And the answer to that question comes from Whitman. It doesn't come from Democratic Vistas, I'm sorry. Although I love Democratic Vistas, and I'm so glad it's been published. It actually does take us back to Song of Myself. It takes us back to the introduction of Song of Myself. And it also takes us outside of the United States. It takes us to Jamaica, the small island country south of the United States, a former colonial possession of the United Kingdom, just as the United States was. The great political leader in Jamaica in the 1970s was Michael Manley. And Michael Manley was an incredible dynamic figure who, he's a socialist. He campaigned against the political forces that were more tied to the former colonial powers. And Michael Manley was asked, what's the theme of your campaigning? What economic theory are you advancing? Are you fighting for economic democracy? Are you fighting for political democracy? What are you fighting for? And Michael Manley said, the word is love. The word is love. That was Michael Manley's posters. There were pictures of him throughout Jamaica during the election campaigns. And they literally said, the word is love. And in fact, democracy is rooted in love, right? But a kind of love that you have to go to your great spiritual traditions to understand fully. Democracy is a faith in other people, a love of other people sufficient to believe that if they have enough information, if they have enough freedom to participate, that ultimately they will do the right thing. That may in fact be a romantic vision. It may in fact be too romantic a vision for our times. And yet it is the one thing we cannot lose. And ultimately what we cannot lose is Walt Whitman's greatest explanation of democracy, because like Carl-Schurz, Walt Whitman believed in telling people how to do things. And what Walt Whitman told people to do in the introduction to Leaves of Grass in 1855 was, this is what you shall do. Now he's speaking to Americans at a time of great turbulence, right before the Civil War, when they were figuring out how to be a democracy. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals. Environmentalism. Despise riches. Economic inequality. Give alms to everyone that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Devote your income and labor to others. A redistribution of the wealth. Hate tyrants. Hate those who would be authoritarian, those who would impose their will on you. Argue not concerning God, religious diversity. Argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Respect those you disagree with. Actually interact with them, understand them. Take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men, i.e., do not become a part of a cabal. Do not become a part of a caste, of a grouping so narrow that it would impose its will on all others. Go freely with powerful, uneducated persons. the great masses. Don't just sit in these elite chambers, but go freely with powerful and educated persons, and with the young, and with mothers of families. Think about that. 1855 saying, understand that there is this grouping. There are mothers of families who should be a part of this. At that time, almost no one was more disempowered than a single mother. And yet he was saying, no, you go with these people. Read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life. Examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem and have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of its lips and face, and between the lashes of your eyes, and in every motion and joint of your body. Walt Whitman, 1855. Now, I know I interrupted frequently on going through that, so let me just read the first part of that again. Speaking about a country figuring out how to be a democracy. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals. Despise riches. Give alms to everyone that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Devote your income and labor to others. Hate tyrants. Argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Go freely with powerful and educated persons, and with the young, and with the mothers of families. Brothers and sisters, as we reflect on democracy in America, and as we reflect on democracy in the world, we understand that Carl-Schurz was right, the great skeptic, the great concerned figure. We have to have structures that work. And in America today, we do not have structures that work. We have structures that fail us and have been exploited and shown our vulnerability. But we also have to have faith. We have to have hope. And we have to have a direction in which we are headed. And I would argue that direction is the direction outlined by Walt Whitman. There is, in fact, a democratic vista on the horizon. But we, the people, in our country, in my country, the United States, we have to rise to that vision, and we have to do so through education, through engagement, through a faith in our ability to make a better democracy, but also through a determination to defend it. And I fear that the next time we meet, that we will be discussing a great battle over the defense of democracy in America. Not a new civil war, but that we will be looking at a country that is wrestling as profoundly over the future of democracy in this moment as Schurz and Whitman thought we were in 1871. Schurz and Whitman actually saw in their lifetimes progression in the right direction. It actually ended up that a lot of progress was made. The arc of history did bend toward justice. It is our job to make sure that as much progress is seen in our lifetime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for transporting us. Give it up again for John Nichols. Thank you.